The gardens of Ravensthorn Keep had never looked so beautiful, and Selene Vale had never felt so alone inside them. She stood apart from the palace light, her bare feet cold against the marble path, her fingers loose at her sides where they had no railing to grip and nothing useful to hold. Behind her, the moonflowers bloomed in long silver rows, petals like spilled starlight, trembling softly in the night air. Before her, the ballroom blazed. Warm amber poured from every window. Crystal clinked against crystal. Laughter rolled outward in waves so bright and untroubled, they seemed almost indecent against the silence of the garden. 300 wolves filled that hall tonight. None of them were looking for her. Tonight was the Moonflower Feast, the rarest gathering in the wolf calendar. Moonflowers bloomed only once every 10 years in Ravensthorn's soil, and their flowering marked the one-night tradition demanded the Alpha publicly reaffirm his alliances, honor his house, and stand before his people not merely as a ruler, but as a man choosing his future. It was also, by some exquisite cruelty, the 10th anniversary of the night a 16-year-old Lucien Ravensthorn had pressed his lips to Selene's trembling hands in the dark of the servant corridor and whispered a promise against her knuckles like a secret prayer. "When I become Alpha, you'll stand beside me. I swear it." She had stopped counting the years after 5. By 6, she had stopped rehearsing the words she would say when he finally kept it. By 8, she had stopped flinching when nobles speculated openly about his future bride. By 9, she had become very good at smiling. But the 10th year was different. The 10th moonflower bloom was different. Because 3 weeks ago, Lucien had found her in the healer's garden at dusk, crouching among the foxglove with soil on her hands, and he had crouched beside her, uninvited, unhurried, and said words in his quiet, certain voice that still, after everything, undid something carefully fastened inside her chest. "This feast will be different, Selene. I've been speaking to the council. I am going to make this right." He had said it the way he said things he meant. She had believed him the way she always believed him. Now she searched for his face through the ballroom glass and found him exactly where power always placed him, at the head of the long table, broad and commanding in ceremonial black, the silver wolf, insignia catching the chandelier light across his chest. Even from out here, even through glass and distance and 10 years of slow erosion, the sight of him still struck her somewhere undefended. He was beautiful the way old storms were beautiful, dark-eyed, sharp-jawed, the kind of man a room rearranged itself around without knowing why. His head was tilted slightly, listening to something his council elder was saying. When he smiled that rare, dangerous smile, the wolves nearest him leaned forward almost involuntarily, drawn by some gravity that had nothing to do with rank. Selene pressed her fingers against the cold glass door and watched him. She was looking for something specific, a glance toward the garden, a restlessness in his posture, the particular tension she had learned to recognize when he was thinking of her, a subtle tightening across his shoulders, a stillness behind his eyes that meant his attention was divided. She found none of it. His attention was whole and unhurried and entirely accounted for. Her gaze traveled slowly to the woman seated at his right hand, Lady Mirelle Vorst, daughter of the wealthiest noble house in the Eastern Territories. Ivory gown, dark hair braided with gold wire. A voice, people said, that moved through rooms like music, effortless and designed to be heard. She laughed at something Lucien said and touched his forearm, light and familiar, as though the gesture had been practiced until it looked like instinct. Lucien did not move away. Selene stepped back from the glass. She had known about Mirelle for 3 years. She had smiled through every council dinner, where the woman's name was raised like a flag. She had nodded through 4 separate conversations in which Lucien explained, earnestly, carefully, with his hand warm over hers, that politics required performance and performance was not truth, and truth was what existed between them in private. She had believed in the private truth. She had tended it like a garden. She looked down at the moonflowers around her feet, silver petals, ancient roots, blooming exactly once a decade without being asked to, without being thanked, without any guarantee the night that greeted them would be worth the long wait underground. Her mother had loved moonflowers. Her mother had also died alone in a room no one powerful ever entered. Selene breathed in slowly through her nose. The music from the ballroom swelled. Inside, she could see the nobles rising. A toast, it looked like, glasses lifted, faces turned toward the man at the head of the table who ruled all their futures with such devastating elegance. The council would announce Lucien's official courtship tonight. Everyone in the kingdom already knew. Everyone, perhaps, except the woman still standing in his garden in the dark, holding 10 years of almost like a wound she had never once let anyone see. Something shifted in her chest then. Not shattered, not broken, quicker than that. Like a door long left ajar, finally closing. He is not coming. She had known it for years, she realized. She had simply been too patient, or too afraid, to let herself finish the thought. Behind her, the garden gate creaked. Celine did not turn immediately. She assumed it was a servant. A courier, perhaps. Someone sent to inform her politely that the feast had progressed without her, and she was welcome to return to her quarters. But the footsteps that crossed the moonflower path were too deliberate for a servant, too unhurried for apology. And when she turned, the man standing at the garden's edge was no one she had ever seen at Ravensthorn. She had believed in the private truth for 10 years. She had not known, until this moment, that someone else entirely had been watching the cost of it. Before we continue, please hit the subscribe and like button and tell me which city you're tuning in from. I love to know where this story found you. Now let's dive in. She packed before dawn, not because she was eager, because if she waited until the light came fully, she knew she would find reasons to stay. The familiar weight of her healer's satchel on its hook, the small clay pot of foxglove on the window ledge, the way morning came quietly to her quarters before the rest of the keep stirred. Ravensthorn had never been kind to her, but it had been known, and there was a particular grief in leaving the things you have survived. She was folding her second dress when Lucien opened the door. He did not knock. He never had. For 10 years that small presumption had felt like intimacy. Now it just felt like a habit he had never bothered to examine. "You're actually leaving?" His voice was low. Not a question. "Yes, Celine." He stepped inside, closing the door behind him with deliberate quiet, as though volume were the problem they needed to solve. His eyes moved over the open bag on the bed. Something complicated crossed his face. "You don't know him. I know that you know him." She set the folded dress down carefully. "You know his reputation, his territory, his politics. You've known about him for years, and yet the first thing you said to him last night was a territorial warning, not a question." She paused. "You've never once asked me what I wanted, Lucia. Not once. In 10 years. That's not fair." "No," she agreed quietly. "It isn't." He crossed the room in 3 strides, stopping close enough that she could smell the cedar and cold iron of him. The scent she had loved at 16 and learned to associate with waiting. His dark eyes searched her face with an intensity that would have unmade her a year ago. "Why him?" he asked. The words came out raw, stripped of the careful control he always wore like armor. Celine looked at him steadily. "Because he asked me what I wanted." The silence that followed was the loudest thing she had ever heard inside these walls. Lucien's throat moved. His hands, those hands that had once held hers like they were something worth keeping, curled at his sides. She picked up her bag. He did not stop her. Cale Draven was waiting in the outer courtyard with 2 horses and no entourage, no ceremony, no display of northern power meant to intimidate Ravensthorn's guards, though the guards watched him from the walls with the particular stillness of men who had decided privately not to intervene. He said nothing when she descended the steps, simply took her bag from her shoulder with one hand, secured it to her saddle with practiced efficiency, and turned to his own horse. "That's all?" she asked. He glanced back. What were you expecting? She wasn't certain. Something colder, perhaps, more deliberate. The man-wolves whispered about in lowered voices across every keep from here to the northern coast was not supposed to move with such economy of feeling. No performance, no threat, no visible interest in being observed. "Nothing," she said, and mounted. They rode north as the sun rose behind them. He spoke more than she expected, not urgently, not to fill silence. He seemed entirely comfortable with silence, wearing it the way other men wore rank. But when he spoke, it was to explain things. Nightbane customs she would need to understand before they arrived. The structure of the lunar hunt. The way northern packs read a stranger's posture before their words. "In Nightbane," he said, as they descended into the tree line beyond Ravensthorn's borders, "you are never asked to perform comfort. If the hall is too loud, you leave. No explanation required." Celine looked at him. "And no one takes offense?" "Taking offense at someone's honesty is considered the greater rudeness." She turned that over quietly as the forest deepened around them. By the time they made camp that evening, a small clearing, firelight, the enormous dark pressing in at every edge, she had revised her understanding of him twice. He built the fire himself, set water to heat without asking if she was cold, because apparently he had already noticed she was. When he handed her the travel bread and dried meat from his pack, and she set most of it untouched beside her knee, he said nothing, only added a portion of his own share to her side without comment, his eyes already back on the dark between the trees. "You don't have to do that," she said. "I know." She looked at him across the fire. The light moved over the sharp planes of his face, the silver threading through his dark hair, the old scar running diagonal beneath his jaw that no wolf who healed as quickly as Alpha's did should still be carrying. What could leave a mark like that? She didn't ask. Instead, she said something she hadn't intended to. The words loosened perhaps by firelight and the strange relief of no longer being in that garden. I don't remember the last time I laughed. Actually laughed. Cale considered this seriously, the way he seemed to consider most things. In Nightbane, he said, there is a tradition of telling terrible jokes during the first meal of the hunt. The worse the joke, the greater the honor. She blinked. That's absurd. Deeply. Who decided that? My grandfather. A pause. He was not a clever man. Something broke open in her chest, small and startled and entirely involuntary, and she laughed. It surprised them both. Cale watched her with an expression she could not yet read. Not triumph, not warmth exactly, something more careful than that. He looked back at the fire. Your mother, he said quietly, once stood where you are sitting now. The laughter died in her throat. Selene stared at him. The fire crackled between them. And Cale Draven, the alpha who feared nothing, did not look away. Nightbane did not announce itself. One moment they were moving through dense pine forest, frost-silvered and silent, the kind of silence that pressed against the ears like held breath. Then the trees simply ended, and the territory opened before them like a held secret finally spoken aloud. Selene pulled her horse to a stop without meaning to. It was nothing like Raventhorn. Where Raventhorn Keep rose in pale stone and sharp towers designed to be seen from a distance, built to impress before it welcomed, Nightbane spread low and deliberate across the landscape, as though it had grown from the earth rather than been placed upon it. Dark timber halls with living moss climbing their walls, torches burning silver blue in iron brackets, wolves moving through the settlement with an unhurried ease that suggested a people who had never needed to perform calm, because they had never been afraid inside their own borders. Above it all, carved into the face of the northern mountain at the territory's back, was a temple, ancient, enormous. The stone so old it had taken on the color of the sky behind it, and the symbols running its face were worn smooth by centuries of weather into something more felt than red. The Hall of the First Moon, Cale said beside her, following her gaze. Where the lunar hunt opens. How old is it? Older than the packs that claim it. He nudged his horse forward. Come. They noticed her immediately. Not the way Raventhorn wolves had noticed her, cataloguing her quietly, measuring her bloodline against her borrowed status, finding her insufficient and filing the conclusion away behind polite smiles. This was different. Wolves paused as she passed, not in suspicion, in something closer to recognition which made no sense because she had never set foot in Nightbane in her life. A woman near the eastern hall entrance, broad-shouldered, grey-streaked, carrying the quiet authority of someone who answered to no one she hadn't chosen, looked at Selene directly and pressed one fist briefly to her chest. A greeting, a formal one. Selene slowed. What does that mean? Respect offered freely, Cale said, his voice low. It's not given to guests, only to equals. She looked at him. His expression told her nothing as usual. But he had quickened his pace slightly, and she was beginning to understand that Cale Draven communicated in adjustments rather than declarations. The lunar hunt opened at dusk. The Hall of the First Moon held perhaps 200 wolves, arranged not in the ranked hierarchical seating of a Raventhorn feast, but in wide concentric circles around a central altar. Flat black, stone veined with silver, worn smooth at its center where generations of hands had touched it. The blood moon hung enormous and rust-red through the open ceiling above. The air smelled of pine smoke and something older underneath it, something mineral and alive, like earth just after lightning. Cale stood at the altar's edge and spoke the opening rites in the old tongue. She didn't understand the words but felt their shape, heavy, deliberate, deeply meant. The gathered wolves listened without restlessness. Here, ceremony was not performance. When he finished, a young wolf, barely older than a pup, solemn-faced and clearly honored to be chosen, approached Selene with a shallow stone bowl of dark liquid and waited. She glanced at Cale. Moonwater, he said quietly. Touch the surface, nothing more. She dipped 2 fingers. The reaction was instant. The silver veining in the altar stone nearest her hand brightened, a soft, unmistakable pulse of light, there and gone in a heartbeat. 3 wolves across the circle inhaled sharply. The elder nearest the temple door took one slow step forward and stopped herself, her eyes fixed on Selene's face with an expression of careful, controlled astonishment. The young wolf with the bowl stared up at Selene as though she had done something extraordinary simply by existing. Selene withdrew her fingers and said nothing. Cale said nothing either, but he moved, subtly, without apparent intention, one step closer to her left side. After the ceremony, the wolves ate together in long, unhurried groups, and Celine discovered something that unstitched a knot she hadn't known she'd been carrying for years. They asked her questions. Not polite questions, not the managing, careful inquiries of people assessing how much space she was allowed to occupy. Real ones, about her healer's training, about the properties of foxglove at altitude, about whether the southern packs truly still used bone-setting methods that Nightbane had abandoned 2 generations ago. She answered, and they listened, and no one looked past her shoulder to see if someone more important was waiting to speak. By the time the fire burned low, something in her chest had unknotted itself so gradually she only noticed it was gone by the sudden unfamiliar lightness in its place. Cale found her later, at the base of the mountain path that wound up toward the ancient temple. "You came to Ravensthorn for me specifically," she said. Not a question. She had been arranging pieces since the garden, and she was tired of pretending she hadn't. A pause, then yes. Why? He was quiet long enough that she turned to look at him. "There are things I owe you," he said finally, "that I owe your bloodline. I will explain them. All of them, but not tonight." She accepted that, for now, and turned back to the temple. Its doors were enormous, black stone, sealed, visibly, for years, moss thick in the carved seams. She raised her hand and pressed her palm flat against the surface. The doors opened without sound. Celine stepped forward into the dark, and the vision took her instantly, violent and wordless and absolute. A woman running, a great hall burning behind her. Her face streaked with ash and something desperate, something animal and ferocious. Not fear, but the shape love takes when it becomes survival. And in her arms, wrapped in cloth the color of moonflowers, a baby. The woman looked back once. Her face was Celine's face. The fire swallowed everything. Celine staggered backward into cold air and found Cale's hands already at her shoulders, steadying her without hesitation, his voice low and close and urgent. "What did you see?" She turned to look at him. "My mother," she whispered. She was running. There was fire everywhere. Her throat tightened. She was carrying a child. Something shifted behind Cale's eyes. Grief, she realized. Old and carefully contained, but grief unmistakably. "I know," he said quietly. The blood moon burned above them both. And Celine understood, with a certainty that had nothing to do with logic, that she had not come to Nightbane as a guest. She had come home, he told her at dawn. Not inside the hall, not with ceremony or careful arrangement. Simply at the edge of the northern overlook, where the territory fell away into mist-covered valleys below. 2 cups of bitter pine tea between them, the kind of cold morning that made everything feel stripped of pretense. Catel spoke without preamble. She had already noticed that about him. He did not soften difficult things with scaffolding. He simply handed them to you and trusted you to hold them. "The Hollow Kingdom was the oldest wolf territory on the continent," he began. "Not the most powerful, not the most feared, but the oldest. The moonbound line ruled it. Wolves whose bond magic ran deeper than mate marks or pack ties. They could share memory, grief, strength, across distance, across death sometimes." He paused. The other councils found that deeply inconvenient. Celine kept her eyes on the valley. Inconvenient. Power that cannot be controlled is always inconvenient to those who built their authority on controlling it. He drank. 26 years ago, the Eastern and Western councils reached a quiet agreement. No declaration, no formal war. That would have required justification. Instead, they cut supply lines, poisoned alliances, funded internal dissent until Hollow Kingdom's own borders became hostile to it. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. By the time the fires came, there was nothing left to defend. The morning sat between them, grey and cold and very still. "My mother," Celine said, "Princess Marin of the Hollow bloodline. Last of her line." He turned the cup slowly in his hands. She escaped with the one thing the councils feared most. Her daughter, a moon-bound heir. Celine's breath came out slowly. "She hid me in Ravensthorn, the one territory neutral enough to ask no questions. She paid that neutrality with her silence, her identity, her history, her name. She became a healer's assistant in the servant quarters, and she raised you as an orphan of no consequence, because a girl of no consequence is a girl no council bothers to eliminate." He paused. "She was the bravest woman I have ever known." The word eliminate landed with quiet precision and did not leave. Celine set down her cup. "Lucien's family," she said. "They controlled the council. They would have known about the agreement." She felt the shape of it settle over her. Not like a shock, but like a confirmation of something her body had understood long before her mind caught up. "They knew who I was." Yes, one word. No cushioning, because there wasn't any. She sat with it. The decade of almost love. The private promises, the public silences. all of it rearranging itself now into a pattern she wished she could not see so clearly. Did he know? Her voice stayed level. She was proud of that. I don't believe so. Cale's honesty was always precise. He did not offer comfort he could not verify. The council kept their ledgers carefully. What Lucien's father knew, and what he passed to his son, are separate questions. Separate questions that changed everything and nothing simultaneously. She asked to see his scar that afternoon. She wasn't certain what prompted it. The healer's instinct, perhaps, or simply the need to do something with her hands, while the morning's revelations resettled inside her. He went still when she asked, the way he went still when something surprised him, which was rarely. Then he turned and pulled the collar of his shirt aside. The scar ran from beneath his jaw down across his collarbone. Not a clean line, but layered, complex, the kind that spoke of something that had tried very hard and been survived with difficulty. Rogue Alpha, he said. 12 years ago, he was faster than anticipated. Celine pressed 2 careful fingers to the outer edge of it, still rigid in places, never properly treated. She began working the old tissue methodically, the way her mother had taught her, and Cale sat without comment, though she felt the muscle beneath her hands carry a tension he was choosing not to express. You should have had this seen to immediately, she said. There was no one I trusted to. She looked up at him. He was watching her work with an expression she recognized now. That careful, contained attention he gave things he considered important. I never intended to love you, he said. The words arrived so quietly she almost missed them. I came to Ravensthorn because I made a promise to your mother, to find you, protect you, deliver you from whatever danger Ravensthorn's politics would eventually manufacture. He paused. It was a duty, a debt I owed her, nothing more. Celine kept her hands steady. And now? The silence lasted long enough to be its own answer. Now, he said finally, I find that duty has become considerably more complicated. She did not push further, neither did he. But something shifted in the air between them, careful and new and entirely mutual. She heard the horses first. 3 of them, moving fast up the northern approach, the rhythm familiar in a way that found her before she consciously placed it. She was already standing when Cale appeared in the doorway behind her, his posture immediately different, measured, alert, every line of him reorganizing around a threat assessment. Below at Nightbane's outer boundary, a rider dismounted in the grey afternoon light, dark hair, ceremonial black travel coat. The silver wolf insignia of Ravensthorn keep catching the pale northern sun. Lucien Ravensthorn stood at the edge of Cale's territory and looked up toward the hall with the expression of a man who had ridden without stopping and arrived only slightly too late to matter, and somehow, disastrously, still looked like everything she had ever wanted. Cale went down to meet him first. Celine watched from the overlook as the 2 men stood at Nightbane's boundary, close enough that the conversation was deliberate, far enough that it was not yet a confrontation. She could not hear the words. She could read everything else. The precise stillness of Cale's posture, the controlled urgency in Lucien's, the way neither man moved toward the other, 2 gravitational forces balancing at exact and careful distance. It lasted 4 minutes. Then Cale turned and looked up at her. She descended. Lucien looked worse than she had expected. 2 days of hard riding had stripped away the ceremonial polish, the careful composure he wore like a second coat in Ravensthorn's halls. What remained was something rawer and less managed, dark circles, a jaw unshaved, eyes that found her immediately across the courtyard and did not move from her face with the focused, almost desperate attention of a man who had rehearsed this moment for 2 days and already understood it was not going to go the way he'd rehearsed. Celine, her name in his voice, still, even now, a specific kind of damage. You rode through the night, she said. Yes, he exhaled, a short, frustrated sound directed entirely at himself. Because I should have said this years ago. Because I am saying it now, here, in front of his territory and his wolves and whoever else is watching. He stepped forward. I love you. I have loved you since you were 16 years old in a servant corridor, telling me I had spinach in my teeth before my first council address, and I have done almost everything wrong since then, and I know that. But I am asking you to come home. The courtyard was not empty. Nightbane wolves had found reasons to be nearby, unhurried, unobtrusive but present witnesses. Lucien did not lower his voice for them. In 10 years he had never once said those words in a room that could hear them. She felt it land, that particular treacherous warmth of being publicly claimed by the person you had wanted to claim you for a decade. Her body recognized it before her mind could arm itself. Cale stood 6 feet to her right, saying nothing, his arms loose at his sides, not intervening, trusting her, she realized, to hold the ground herself. You left Lady Morel's courtship feast, she said carefully. To ride 2 days north and tell me this. Yes, the council can manage themselves. Something fierce moved across his face. I am done managing myself into silence for the council. That's a very large statement from someone who has had 10 years to make it. His jaw worked. I know. Why now, Lucia? She kept her voice even. What changed 3 days ago that hadn't changed in 10 years? The question sat between them and neither of them looked away from it. When he spoke again, his voice had dropped. Not from shame, but from the weight of something he had carried alone for a very long time. When I was 22, he said, I went to my father and told him I intended to choose you. Publicly, formally, before the council. He stopped. He showed me a document. Council correspondence, internal, sealed, predating my ascension. A contingency protocol. Celine waited. If I claimed you openly, if I elevated you to Luna, or even announced formal courtship, the council had agreed unanimously to classify you as a political liability. His voice was controlled and absolutely hollow. They would have eliminated you within the season. Quietly, in a way that could not be traced back to them or to me. The courtyard air was very cold. I was 22, he said. I had just become alpha. I had no coalition strong enough to move against the full council without destroying the pack entirely. And they knew that. His eyes held hers. So I made the only choice that kept you alive. I kept my distance. I kept you ordinary. A healer's apprentice of no political consequence. A girl too unremarkable to eliminate. Celine heard the words, understood them, felt the terrible specific logic of them click into place alongside everything Kale had told her at dawn. They had all known what she was. Lucien had known she was in danger, and said nothing. The council had known she was the hollow heir, and orchestrated her invisibility around that knowledge. And she had spent 10 years feeling unremarkable when she had in fact been surrounded, carefully, deliberately, by people managing the threat of her existence. Lucien. Her voice was very quiet. He looked at her with something so unguarded it was almost unbearable. You believed, she said slowly. That silence protected me. Yes, you watched me disappear into 10 years of waiting. You watched me enter rooms through servant doors. You stood beside Mirelle Vost at your own feast while I stood in your garden alone. Each word landed clean and separate. And you believed that was protection. I believed it was survival. You believed, she said, that my survival was worth more than my knowledge of my own life. Lucien opened his mouth, closed it. She stepped forward, close enough that this was entirely between them now. I would have fought, she said softly. I would have run. I would have found another way. I was not a child to be kept ignorant for her own safety. Her voice did not tremble. She was done trembling. I deserved the truth, Lucien. The truth was mine. He had no answer. She could see him searching for one. Genuinely, painfully searching, and finding only the long, honest silence of a man who had made a devastating decision with loving intentions and no courage whatsoever. Then why? She asked. Didn't you trust me with it? The wind moved through the courtyard. Lucien Raventhorn, who ruled 300 wolves and commanded the loyalty of every noble house in the Eastern Territories, stood in the cold northern light with nothing left to say. Behind her, she heard Kale exhale once, quietly, without satisfaction. It was the saddest sound she had ever heard him make. Lucien left before nightfall. No ultimatum, no final argument. He simply stood in the courtyard for a long moment after Celine walked away, as though waiting for something to change. And when nothing did, he mounted his horse and rode south into the grey afternoon without looking back. She watched from her window until the tree line swallowed him. Then she sat on the edge of her bed in the small northern room Nightbane had given her, pressed her hands flat against her thighs, and felt the full weight of the last 5 days settle into her bones. All at once. She did not cry. She was not certain she had anything left that resembled grief for the loss of Lucien. What she felt was quieter and more permanent. The particular exhaustion of a woman who had finally set down something very heavy and was only now registering how long she had been carrying it. She fell asleep before the moon rose. The dream was not a dream. She understood that immediately, the way you understand certain things in the dark. Not through logic, but through the body's older knowing. She was standing in a forest she had never seen, silver-barked trees stretching upward into a sky so full of stars it cast its own light. The air smelled of frost and something sweeter beneath it, like crushed moonflowers. Her hands were wrong. She looked down. They were covered in silver-white fur, and they were not hands anymore, and she was not standing. She was low, 4-footed, the ground beneath her paws humming with something vast and patient and ancient, and she understood, with a clarity that bypassed every rational thought she possessed, that this was not a shape being given to her. It was a shape returning. She woke gasping. The room was bright. Not from the lamp, from her. Kale reached her door in seconds. She heard him moving through the hall before the light had fully faded from her skin, and she understood dimly that he must have felt something, though she could not yet explain how. He stepped inside and stopped. His expression did what it rarely did, shifted visibly, not alarm. Something more complex than that. "Your eyes," he said. She crossed to the small mirror above the washstand. Her eyes were silver, bright and complete as a full moon, edged in the faintest ring of gold. The color would settle, she knew instinctively, into something closer to her usual grey-green. But right now they were something else entirely. "It's happening," Kale said behind her. His voice was careful and very low. "My wolf." She touched the glass. "I always assumed I didn't have one, that I was simply ordinary." Something moved across his face that might have been the ghost of a smile. "Your wolf was suppressed. Old protection magic, woven into your bloodline before you were born. Your mother's doing." He paused. "Or someone who loved her very much." Celine lowered her hand from the mirror. Then she felt it. It was nothing like she would have described it if asked. Not a rush, not a flood. More like a door in a house she had lived in for 26 years quietly opening to reveal a room she had never known existed. And from that room, without warning, without permission, something reached outward. Kale went very still. "Celine, I'm not doing it intentionally." Her voice came out thin. "I don't know how to stop. Don't stop it." His voice dropped to something careful. "Just breathe." What moved between them was not words. It was worse than words, more precise than language, less deniable. She felt him receive it. 10 years of waiting compressed into something wordless and enormous. The specific grief of being loved privately and insufficient publicly. The exhaustion she had described to no one, the terrifying fragile newness of the last 5 days. And in return, before he could stop it, she felt him. Guilt, old and deeply buried. A promise made at a dying woman's bedside. Years of watching from a careful distance. Something newer and far less controlled sitting just beneath the surface of all that discipline. Warm and specific and directed entirely at her. They stared at each other across the small room. Kale crossed to her in 3 steps. She did not move away. He raised one hand and pressed his palm against her jaw, his thumb at her cheekbone, with the precise gentleness of a man who had touched very few things carefully and meant this to be counted among them. His eyes searched hers, silver meeting winter steel, and what she saw there was not the feared Northern Alpha, not the dangerous legend, not the man who had conquered rogue territories without mercy. Just a man who had carried her mother's grief for 12 years, and was not entirely certain what to do with the fact that he had stopped being sorry she existed and started being terrified of losing her. She kissed him first. It was quiet, almost painfully so. His hand stayed at her jaw, and neither of them moved for a long moment afterward, foreheads touching, the shared memory of what had just passed between them, settling into something neither could unfeel. "I know," he said softly, "not to the kiss, to everything underneath it." The messenger arrived an hour later. Council communication from Ravensthorn, stamped with the Eastern Province seal. Kale read it without expression, then handed it to her without preamble. "The she-wolf Celine Vale is hereby classified a threat to interpack stability and ordered to present herself for council review." She set the letter down. Below them, through the stone floor, they both felt it simultaneously, a deep and resonant trembling, moving upward from somewhere ancient and enormous beneath the mountain. The ruined stones in the courtyard began to glow. Kale looked at her. "It's the ruins," she said. "Yes, they're waking up. Yes." He held her gaze steadily. "And the council already knows. They came at midnight, no declaration, no formal challenge that would have required acknowledging Nightbane as a sovereign territory and Celine as something worth declaring war over. Instead, the council sent what it had always preferred, a quiet solution. 40 wolves in unmarked leathers moving through the northern tree line in 4 coordinated groups, carrying no insignia, following orders that would leave no written record. Nightbane's sentinels found them first. The horn that split the night air was a single long note, low and resonant, nothing like Ravensthorn's sharp military calls, more like the territory itself exhaling a warning. Kale was already moving before it finished, his hand at Celine's arm, his voice stripped to its operational core. "Stay inside the hall." "I am not staying inside the hall." 1 second of eye contact, he let go of her arm. "Stay behind me then." He reached the door. "And do exactly what I say when I say it. No arguments, no heroics, no touching the ruins until I tell you it's safe." She followed him into the dark. The fighting was not like the stories. There was nothing cinematic in it, no clean lines, no dramatic pauses. Nightbane wolves were fast and disciplined, and fighting on ground they had known since childhood, which gave them an advantage the council's soldiers spent their first minutes discovering it. significant personal cost. But 40 was 40 and they were coordinated, and 3 of the groups had split to target the ancient temple specifically. Not Celine, the temple. She registered that with a cold, specific clarity as she moved with Kale through the outer courtyard. They weren't primarily here for her. They were here to destroy the ruins before whatever was waking inside them finished waking. The council never feared her becoming Luna. The realization arrived whole and devastating. They feared what was already written in the stones beneath her feet. Kale took down 2 attackers near the eastern wall with the efficient brutality of a man who had learned long ago that hesitation cost more than it saved. She stayed close, her healer's training actively unhelpful, and her new wolf straining against instincts she did not yet know how to govern. Then she heard it, a specific sound she had not heard before and would not forget. Kale making no sound at all. She turned. He was on one knee at the base of the temple steps. A blade, coated in something that was not ordinary steel, something that smelled wrong and moved through the moonlight with a dull reddish sheen, had caught him beneath his left arm where the armor gapped at the joint. An old design understood with horror, specifically designed. Someone had researched how Kale Draven moved before they sent people to stop him. The wolf who had thrown it was already down. It had not mattered. She crossed to Kale in seconds, dropping beside him, her hands already reading the wound before her mind caught up. Deep, yes, but the blade itself was the problem. Whatever compound coated it moving. Against his healing rate, slowing it, the flesh around the entry point already grey-tinged in the torchlight. "I'm fine," he said. "You are absolutely not fine." She pressed her palm flat against it, applying the only thing she had immediately available, pressure and the specific focused intent her mother had taught her before. She was old enough to understand what she was learning. Stop talking and stay still. The temple, I know about the temple. A sound at the outer wall, voices, not Nightbane voices. And beneath them, another voice she recognized with a shock that nearly broke her concentration entirely. Lucien, he had come back. Not with the council's forces, against them. She realized as the shape of it became visible through the chaos. He stood at the northern gate with 6 of his personal guard, and he was not fighting Nightbane wolves. He was blocking the 3rd council unit from advancing, his sword drawn, his voice carrying the absolute authority of a man who had spent 20 years being obeyed, and was using every last measure. It now stand down, flat, final. This is an unauthorized action. You are operating without alpha sanction, and I will personally hold every wolf here accountable before the full Eastern Council. They hesitated. Lucien's guard did not. In the space that hesitation opened, Nightbane wolves moved through the remaining attackers with devastating efficiency. It was over in minutes. The courtyard fell into an exhausted, smoking quiet. Lucien sheathed his sword and crossed toward her. He took in Kale's condition in one glance, and whatever complex equation lived behind his eyes, it resolved into something uncomplicated. "Tell me what you need," he said to Celine. What she needed was inside the temple. She understood it the way she had understood things since arriving in Nightbane. Not through reasoning, but through the older knowledge. Her bloodline had been waiting 26 years to return to her. The ruins beneath the mountain contained something her mother's line had left there, a reservoir of moonbound power, stored against the day it would be needed. Kale's hand closed around her wrist as she stood Celine. His voice was strained but precise. "If you go in there, you may not come back as you are." She looked at him, the wound, the grey spreading at its edges, his winter steel eyes holding hers without flinching despite the cost of that. Steadiness. "And if I don't go in," she said, "you won't come back at all." She looked down at his hand on her wrist, then at the temple. The ruins pulsed gold beneath the blood moon, patient and enormous and waiting, as they had been waiting for 500 years. Celine stepped forward. The ruins swallowed her whole. Not violently, there was no resistance, no threshold to force. The temple simply received her the way deep water receives something that was always meant to sink into it, closing around her presence with a recognition so complete it felt like the absence of struggle rather than the beginning of it. The chamber beneath the mountain was vast in the way of things not built for human scale. Columns of black stone rising into darkness above, the floor beneath her feet warm despite the cold outside, veined with silver that moved. She understood now it had always moved, like something breathing. Every surface carved with symbols her eyes could not read, and her blood understood entirely. At the chamber's center, a basin, wide and shallow and filled not with water but with light, silver white. The precise color of the wolf she had become in her dream, the color of what she was. She walked toward it without hesitation. The knowledge did not arrive like a vision this time. It arrived like memory. her own memory of a life she had not lived, generations of it, stacked and patient, waiting for the mind equipped to hold it. Moonbound queen standing where she stood, receiving what she was receiving, understanding what the councils had spent 500 years ensuring no one would be left to understand. The moonbound bond was not fate. That was the truth they had killed a kingdom to bury. The wolf councils had built their entire authority on the sacred immovability of mate bonds. The moon chose, the wolves obeyed, and in that obedience the councils found their leverage. If bonds could not be questioned, neither could the hierarchies built around them. If the moon's choice was absolute, then those who claimed to interpret the moon held absolute power. But moonbound queens had always known otherwise. The bond was a beginning, an offering. A door the moon opened and then stepped back from. What you do with the door, the memory said in her mother's voice and a dozen voices before her mother's, has always been yours. She was not bound by prophecy. She was not destined for Kale the way weather was destined for a season. Inevitable, impersonal, requiring nothing of either of them. She could choose. She had always been able to choose. The councils had destroyed the Hollow Kingdom specifically to ensure that truth never reached another generation. Celine pressed her hands into the basin of light. What moved through her was not power in the way stories described power. Not lightning, not fire, not the dramatic physical rupture of something supernatural breaking free. It was quieter and more absolute than that. Like every door in a dark house opening simultaneously to reveal that the house had always been lit, and she had simply been standing in the one room without windows. Her wolf settled into her spine like a key finding its lock. Her moonbound gift opened fully, and she felt the territory around her. Kael outside the temple, his life's rhythm slowed and labored but present, still present, the wound's progress measurable now, in a way that told her she had minutes rather than moments. Lucien at the outer wall, his decision already made before she entered, carrying it the way he should have carried his love for her, openly, at personal cost, without asking for credit. She felt the council's architecture next old, extraordinarily old. A network of binding agreements woven into the territorial borders of every pack on the continent, generations deep, each one anchored to a central instrument housed in Ravensthorn's lowest vault. Not magic in the moonbound sense, smaller than that, meaner, the accumulated legal and spiritual weight of 500 years of documented control, each agreement referencing the one before it, an unbroken chain designed to make its own dismantling illegal. She found the first link. She broke it outside. Lucien felt it. She knew because she felt him feel it, the moonbound awareness reaching outward without effort now, reading the emotional landscape of everyone connected to her history. He was standing at the northern gate when the first binding snapped, and the expression that crossed his face was not surprise, but the particular grief of a man watching something he built from fear finally come apart at the foundation. He reached into his coat and withdrew the Ravensthorn seal, the Alpha's mark, the instrument through which every council decision for 20 years had been authorized. He broke it over his knee without ceremony, without witnesses except Nightbane wolves who would remember. The Eastern Council's authority over Ravensthorn died in that moment as cleanly as any battle could have managed, and Lucien Ravensthorn stood in the ruins of his inheritance with the expression of a man who had just set down the heaviest thing he had ever carried and found, beneath the exhaustion, something that felt almost like relief. She came back to herself at the basin's edge. Kael was inside the chamber. She did not know how he had moved with the wound still in him. Stubbornness, she suspected, or the particular refusal of a man whose definition of acceptable risk had always been calibrated around. Everyone except himself, he was upright, barely, one hand against the nearest column. She went to him immediately, her hands finding the wound with the new precision her fully opened gift provided. The healing moving through her palms with a warmth that had nothing borrowed in it anymore. "You were supposed to stay outside," she said. "I was," he agreed. His breathing was shallow but steadying beneath her hands. "Kael, I would have loved you," he said very quietly, "even if the moon had never marked you." She stilled. "I want you to know that." His eyes held hers in the silver light of the chamber, stripped of every layer his reputation required him to maintain. "Not because of bloodlines. Not because of prophecy or debt or what I promised your mother." He paused. "You specifically. Who you are when no one is watching. The way you heal things without being asked. The way you laughed at my grandfather's terrible joke and looked surprised that you'd done it." Something in his expression went very careful and very sincere. "That is what I love." The moon had nothing to do with it. Celine looked at him for a long moment. Then she pressed her palm flat against the wound one final time, and let everything she could not yet say move through the moon-bound connection between them instead. He exhaled slowly. The grey faded from the wound's edges. Below them, deep in the mountain's foundation, the last of the council's ancient binding structure came apart in silence. 500 years of carefully maintained architecture dissolving not in fire or catastrophe, but in the quiet, irreversible way that lies dissolve when the truth finally has enough room to stand. The chamber filled with silver light, and held it. Spring came slowly to the north. It did not arrive the way it arrived in Ravensthorn. Sudden and performative. The palace gardens erupting overnight into the kind of beauty designed to be witnessed from ballroom windows. In Nightbane, and in the new settlement rising beside it where Hollow Kingdom's foundations had been cleared of 5 centuries of stone and silence, spring came incrementally, a degree of warmth each morning, birdsong returning one species at a time, the frost retreating from the valley floor like something that had decided, without announcement, that its work here was finished. Celine noticed all of it. She had spent 10 years learning not to notice things too closely, because noticing required hoping, and hoping had a cost she'd grown careful about paying. That particular economy was dissolving now, slowly, the way old habits dissolved, not in a moment of decision but in the accumulated evidence of days that did not require it anymore. She was in the healer's garden. Her garden, the one Nightbane wolves had built without being asked in the weeks following the council's dissolution. When Lucien found her, he looked better than he had at the northern gate. Rested, she thought. Lighter in some way that had nothing to do with what he was carrying, and everything to do with having finally chosen what he would, and would not carry going forward. The Ravensthorn seal was gone from his coat. She noticed its absence the way you noticed the absence of a sound you had grown so accustomed to, you'd stopped hearing it until it stopped. "I'm leaving tomorrow," he said. She set down the foxglove cutting she'd been working with. "Where?" "South first." "Then I don't know." He said it without distress. "I've been Alpha of Ravensthorn since I was 20 years old. I have made every decision, every significant decision of my adult life. In relation to that fact," he paused, "I think I would like to find out what I decide when it isn't the first consideration." Celine looked at him steadily. This was the Lucien she had loved at 16, before the council and the weight of inheritance had finished their work on him, uncertain and honest, and moving towards something without knowing its name. She had spent years mourning that version of him as though it were lost. It had simply been buried. Recoverable, it turned out, at significant personal cost. "Eamon will hold Ravensthorn until the new structure is established," he continued. His first act was to formally dissolve the Eastern Council's authority. Second was to send reparation correspondence to Nightbane. A pause. Third was to have my father's study cleared. I didn't ask him to do that one. He did it because he understood. Eamon was always more perceptive than you gave him credit for. A faint smile crossed his face. The real one, the rare one she had catalogued at 16 as something worth remembering. Yes, they stood together in the garden for a moment that neither of them rushed. There was grief here. She did not pretend otherwise, and neither did he. Not the sharp grief of catastrophe, but the longer, quieter grief of something that had been real and was genuinely over. The almost love, the decade of private truth that had been too afraid of itself to become public fact. It had mattered. It would always have mattered. That was not a revision she needed to make. "I'm sorry," he said, simply, without architecture. "I know." She meant it without reservation. "So am I." He nodded once, looked at the foxglove, looked back at her. "Are you happy?" The question was genuine and entirely without claim. Ask the way you asked about someone else's life, when you had accepted it was someone else's life. Celine considered it honestly. "I'm becoming happy," she said. "I think that's better." Lucien exhaled slowly. "Yes," he said, "I think it probably is." He left before sunset. She watched him ride south until the valley turned him into a silhouette and then into nothing, and she held the grief of it cleanly, without bargaining, until it settled into the specific and permanent shape of something survived. Then she turned back toward the mountain. Cale was at the overlook where she had first learned the truth about her mother. He did not turn when she arrived beside him, but his posture adjusted almost imperceptibly, the subtle reorganization she had learned to recognize as his version of reaching for her without moving. His hands. Below them the Hollow Kingdom settlement glowed with early lamplight. New timber, old stone foundations finally cleared and built upon. Wolves from 3 territories who had responded to the bloodline's awakening with the particular loyalty of people who had been waiting for permission to come home. It was small. It would grow. Cale was quiet for a long time. Then he said, without turning, "What do you want?" The question landed the way it had always landed. The first time a stranger in a moonlit garden had asked it and rearranged something fundamental inside her. She understood now that he had asked it then, knowing exactly what it cost someone to be asked it after years of not being asked. He was asking it again now for the same reason. Because with Kale Draven, there was no version of love that did not begin with that question. No bond claimed without her hand extended first. No future decided in her absence. Celine looked at the kingdom below. At the mountain above, at the man beside her, dangerous and careful and entirely, terrifyingly sincere. "You," she said. "This. A life I chose with both hands," he turned then. What crossed his face was not triumph or relief, but something quieter than either. The expression of a man receiving something he had not allowed himself to want until it was already standing beside him, asking to stay. He took her hand. Below them, in the dark soil of the valley, the first moonflowers of the season opened their silver petals to the night. Not in Ravensthorn's manicured garden rose, not beneath ballroom windows or palace lights. Here, in the recovered ground of a kingdom that had survived everything used against it. For the first time in her life, Celine was not waiting to be chosen. The moon, the kingdom, and the future were waiting for her instead. If you enjoyed this story, let me know in the comments below. Your support helps me bring more moonlit stories like this to life. Don't forget to subscribe for more tales of wolves, romance, and second chances that refuse to stay buried.